Okay, so we're going to get started. I'm sorry for any glitches that you or delays or anything, but we're all here together. Welcome. Welcome to our final book talk for spring of 2021. And my name is Abigail Gilman. I'm a professor of Hebrew, German, and Comparative Literature here at Boston University. And our series has been sponsored by the Elie Wiesel Center for Jewish Studies, directed by Michael Zank. Michael is teaching, not unfortunately, but teaching right now, and unfortunately can't be with us today. I want to thank our center administrator, Teresa Cooney, and especially Jeremy Solomons, the communications coordinator for the Elie Wiesel Center, and the Zoom Meister of our events, for all of your help and all of your work. I want to introduce Khadija El-Karfi, who's the graduate student communications assistant at the center. And she will be playing a role in the talk today as well. She's a native of Rabat, Morocco, and a PhD candidate here at BU in the Department of Romance Studies. I also want to acknowledge the Leon and Alice Newton Fund in Jewish Studies, which has given us resources to bring so many incredible scholars to campus, and which is also contributing to our book talk series. So today we will be discussing a book titled The Lost Orchard, The Palestinian Arab Citrus Industry, 1850 to 1950, which is about to be published by Syracuse University Press. And it is co-authored by Mustafa Kabha and Nahum Karlinsky. And this book tells an untold story, an as yet untold story. And I believe this is the first book event about this book. So that's really an honor. And now I will just introduce our speakers. First of all, Nahum Karlinsky. Nahum studies the social, cultural, economic history of modern Israel-Palestine. He studies modern Jewish philanthropy and Hasidism and fundamentalism and historiography. He's a senior lecturer at Ben-Gurion Research Institute for the study of Israel and Zionism. And since 2012, he has been teaching at BU, one course every year. I wanted to mention that in 2018, he directed a conference on Israeli diaspora here at BU. And that volume based on that conference is about to be published by University of Texas Press. It's absolutely fascinating conference. And he has been absolutely integral into our efforts to build Israel studies here at BU. His publications include a book titled California Dreaming, Ideology, Society, and Technology in the Citrus Industry of Palestine, 1890 to 1939. And another book which appeared in Hebrew. The translated title is Counter History in Hebrew, Historia Shekeneged. And it's about Hasidic epistles from Israel. Really fascinating topic, which I had no idea that, Nahum, that you worked on until recently. And a warm welcome to our respondent today, Alon Confino, professor of history and Jewish studies and director of the Institute for Holocaust, Genocide, and Memory Studies at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. Alon is a historian. He focuses on Germany, on Israel, and on the Holocaust. He writes about history and memory and historiography, how history is told and written, and the role of storytelling. And I'll mention two of his books. One is titled Foundational Pasts, The Holocaust as Historical Understanding, Cambridge University Press, 2012. and A World Without Jews, The Nazi Imagination from Persecution to Genocide, from Yale Press 2014. I just mentioned that when I read about you that you are interested in storytelling and experimenting with historical narrative, I realized that the question you ask in the preface to that book has stayed with me till today, which was the question of why the Nazis burned Sifrei Torah in Kristallnacht. Why did they care to do that? Why? You actually just asked that as a question, and it has stayed with me. That's it for the introductions. Welcome, everybody. I'm very much looking forward to our today's session, and also to your participation. So we will begin with Nahum's presentation with some slides. We will have a response from Alon. We will have a response to the counter response from Nahum, perhaps briefly, we'll see. And after that, we will open it up for questions. You can write questions in the chat and at any point. So I turn this over to Nahum.
Thank you, Abigail, and thank you, everybody, for joining us. And it's an honor to see so many faces and some of the names I recognize. So hello, everybody, and it's really a pleasure. And as you said, Abigail, it's the first book launch for this book. So it's thank you. It's Chora for that. First of all, I want to apologize for everybody that Mustafa Kabha cannot join us today, unfortunately. But he passed on to me a few notes that he wanted us me to make, and his input in the research it will be noticed immediately. And I want, before I begin, I want to thank, first of all, Professor Gilman for inviting me for this book launch. It's an honor. I want to thank Jeremy Solomon for organizing that, all the technical aspects, very efficient and in a good way. So thank you so much, Jeremy. Special thanks to Professor Michael Zank, who is not here, who invited me to teach at the Elie Wiesel Center a while ago. And this has been an ongoing pleasure for me to teach and to enjoy the warm welcoming of Professor Zank and the faculty and the staff at the center. So it has been a pleasure. And also I want to take this opportunity to thank Dr. Teresa Cooney, the program administrator of the center, with her wonderful staff. And finally, I want to thank Alon, Confino for responding to this book and the event. I will divide my talk into two main parts. First of all, I want to present the process that led Mustafa and I to do the research together. And then I will present the book rather shortly. Okay, let me share the screen with you. So, before I present how Mustafa and I met and began doing the research together, just a few words about the industry itself and its importance. So, in terms of chronology, we're talking about the British Mandate period, roughly between 1918 to 1948. And I just want to present a snapshot of the industry at the eve of the outbreak of World War II. On the right, we can see a map of British Mandate Palestine. In the green are the Palestinian population, and in blue, Jewish population according to the region or districts of Palestine. The citrus industry was really a very important industry for the country as a whole. First of all, it was the country's major export industry. Around 70% of the export value of the country was from citrus. You can compare it to the high-tech now industry in Israel. It was a very highly profitable industry due to the high demand in the UK and Europe, began at the mid-19th century and continued throughout the period that we're talking about. It was an economic engine that transformed Jaffa into a cultural and economic center for Palestinian society. It was only second to Jerusalem in this respect. By 1939, the industry was equally divided between Palestinian Arab and Zionist sectors. Just a word about terms. When I'm talking about the Palestinian and the Zionist, I'm talking about Zionist and sectors according to their collective identity. But we assume that not everybody was a Zionist or nationalist on the Palestinian side. But when we talk about the collective, we use the national collective on both societies. It was a source of employment for a significant portion of the population, Arab and Jewish alike. And for Zionists, it was a symbol of returning to the land and claiming the homeland. In terms of demography, I hope you can see it. About 1,300,000 Palestinian Arabs lived on the land, and about a third of the population was Jewish. So Mustafa and I first met back in Sde Boker, where my academic home is, the Sde Boker Research Institute, at a conference. I heard about Mustafa, but never met him before. Let me just introduce some of Mustafa's scholarship. Mustafa is an expert on the Palestinian Arab society during the Mandate. His first book is about the Palestinian press during the Mandate. He also published many books and articles on the Arab revolt, and an important book about the Palestinian people, a history of the Palestinian people, in which he claims a very interesting claim, in my opinion, that the Palestinian people were constructed or became a people, a nation, when they lived on the land. And their identity is basically attached to the land itself. This is a picture of Mustafa lecturing. I think this is Edward Said in the background. But I also like this picture of Mustafa on his homeland. So this is Mustafa's scholarship. As Abigail mentioned, my second book was on the citrus industry up to 1939, and I mainly concentrated on the Jewish Zionist aspect. The reason is that I grew up on a certain collective identity and understanding of the history. And like me, I think many Israeli Jews grew up on the same narrative. So I want to express, to share with you the way I developed my understanding of the industry, and in general, we can take from that also the understanding Israeli and Zionist history in many ways. So there are three layers that I discovered. The first one was the one that I was familiar with, that according to Israeli Jewish meta-narrative, the citrus industry before 1948, before the Nakba, before the Palestinian catastrophe, and after that was built and established by the Zionist labor movement. This is an iconic picture of that. This is a kibbutz, and by the new Jew who toured the land and turned the old Jew to a new, strong Jew. This was the image that I came to do my research in the first place. But then I discovered another layer. The more realistic layer, that the industry on the Jewish side was mainly established by private capitalist Zionist entrepreneurs who built their colonies, or moshavot in Hebrew, around Jaffa. And this is a picture of one of their really rich and elaborate houses. And they were regarded during the time as capitalist and in many ways also colonialist by the labor movement. On the other side, the labor movement tried to build an independent Jewish enclave on the land that would be based only on Jewish labor, on Jewish culture, and so forth. And they struggled, what they term struggle for Jewish labor, but actually it was taking many Palestinian Arabs who worked in the citrus groves of the Jewish and the Arabs from working in these groves, and they instigated demonstrations and tried to stop that. So the struggle between the private entrepreneurs who were the backbone of the industry and the labor movement over employment of Arabs in the groves was one major aspect of the industry and the country in general, because it was also a struggle over the ownership of the land of the home and the homeland in general. But then I discovered that actually the citrus industry was, when the Zionists came first to the land at the end of the 19th century, the industry was already built by Palestinian entrepreneurs. So this is a picture of Jaffa. That was the hub of the Palestinian industry. We see citrus groves here. Here's the port in which they were exported to Britain mainly. And this is the way they were loaded on the citrus crates were loaded on boats, and because of there were works in the harbor, and moved to bigger ships that were there. I tried to, in my book, I tried to address the Palestinian industry a bit, but I was not familiar enough with this aspect, and I thought it was really important for anyone who studies Israel and Zionist history to understand that. And this is where I met Mustafa the second time, same time at a conference at my home university. Little did I know that he also had or has a personal aspect to that. And I would like to ask Hadija El-Karfi to read Mustafa memoirs about that are now incorporated into our book. Please, thank you.
Thank you, Nahum. So I'll start reading. For me, Jaffa, which was the hub of the pre-1948 Palestinian Arab citrus industry and the country's main marine port, is not simply a time-honored city where remnants of ancient buildings attest to a magnificent past. I grew up in the small village of al-Qutuf. As a child, I reveled in my father's stories of Jaffa, where he had lived in its heyday during the years of 1934 to 1948. I was particularly enchanted by stories of the special, intoxicating aroma of the citrus blossoms, whose perfume would envelop Jaffa in the spring. My father, Daoud Ibrahim Kabha, used to transport coal to the towns of Tulkarm and Jaffa. In time, he opened a coal store in Jaffa, selling coal that served as an important source of energy for heating and for use in various dining establishments and restaurants. During the long winter nights, he would tell us stories of cafes, cinemas, and the theater. He was very proud of having attended concerts by famous singers like Kulthum and Muhammad Abdul Wahab when they performed in Jaffa in the 1940s. I visited Jaffa with my father twice. He told me detailed stories that I had never heard before. I was particularly impressed by the story of his last day in Jaffa before it surrendered to Jewish forces in May 1948. At that time, my disappointment morphed into sorrow and pain. Whenever I visit Jaffa, I'm overcome by emotion, and I try to reconstruct past sites, past lives, amid the lost orchards, the scent of the markets, and of the fragrant citrus blossoms. Investigating the lost orchards of Jaffa and of the other Palestinian citrus towns is no easy matter. It is, in essence, a transition from vague memories and scents to dusty archival documents, as well as uprooted trees or rebranded fruits, stamped with a new identity and new owners. The once fertile lands, wells, and pools, now grown as bulldozers, uproot the orchards and cement trucks pour solid foundations for high-rise buildings that have changed the skyline forever. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So now I want to move to describing the book. The book is basically divided into 4 parts. The first part gives the history, combined history of ideology, economic, and social analysis of the citrus industry, the Palestinian Arab citrus industry. The second part that we discovered during our research was a unique binational organization that the 2 sectors established together, bottom up and top down, at the beginning of World War II. And this binational organization, the only one during British Mandate Palestine that actually lasted. There are many ideas about binationalism, but this one, the only one who lasted for a long time, lasted until April 1948, already into the 1948 war. And the third part is about the Nakba, the Palestinian catastrophe, the Palestinian refugees. And finally, the last part of the book is about the Palestinian memory about the citrus industry in Jaffa and the way and forgetfulness of the way Israel and Israeli Jews try to forget, and successfully so, the existence of this binational existence before Israel was established. So on the left, so this is the first part of the book, the history. On the left, we see a map that created by a German Templar who came to Palestine, Sandal, and we see the citrus groves near Jaffa. This is Jaffa, the city. This is the port. And here we see what will become Tel Aviv from 1909 as well. So this is the hub of the citrus industry. It was there was a lot of underground water that were available and close to the port. So it was the natural place for that. As Zionists came to the country and at the end of the 19th century, and from 1890, began planting in citrus. In 1936, the industry was divided almost equally between a Jewish sector near Jaffa and the colonies, the Moshavot, around it, and up in northern of that, and the Palestinian Arab industry was also around Jaffa, around Ramle and Lydia, Tulkarm, and some at Acre and in Gaza. I just want to briefly give some general features of the history of the industry until the outbreak of World War II. So first of all, as I said, it was initiated by local Palestinian entrepreneurs in the middle of the 19th century. Jewish growers began investing in that only at the end of the 19th century. So we have 40 years of sole Palestinian employment in that. Jewish growers saw themselves as Zionists, but also they termed themselves as colonialists, or in Hebrew, colonist, and termed their settlements as colonies. And they used settler colonial methods and worldview in establishing their Zionist enclave on the land. During the Mandate, two national communities developed. These communities, in general, not only the citrus industry, were separated by religion, by culture, by language, by social structure, residential spaces, and ownership of groves. There were no common or shared ownerships of groves between Arabs and Jews during the Mandate. The two sectors and societies influenced each other. This is one of our main conclusions of the research that can be applied to the general period of British Mandate and before. They were not totally separated. There were connections, and even if one society is on the border, we are aware that they are on the boundaries of our society, and we try to keep these boundaries. From the 1930s, there was a growing, until 1930s, they competed against each other. But from the 1930s until 1948, a growing cooperation between the two sectors began. They cooperated in various aspects that I can elaborate more after I finish my talk on technological transfer between the two sectors. The Jewish sector learned a lot from the Palestinian one. Knowledge, the marketing was controlled by the Palestinian sector, and the Zionist sector was dependent for most of the time on the marketing through the Jaffa port. They sat on the same governmental committees, and they had joint exhibitions together. And both sectors shared a free market economic worldview. And most of them were middle-class entrepreneurs on both sides. And the industry, this is also another conclusion of our research, was a major social mobility engine for the Palestinian farmers, for Felichin. Those who invested in that rose up in the social ladder in the villages. Many of them moved to cities as well. And many Palestinians were employed in Jewish groves. We mentioned that before. This is just an analysis of the social strata of the Palestinian citrus industry based on our sources. And we can see that there was an economic or capital accumulation among the Palestinian society. So about 36 or 37% of owners owned groves in size between 1 dunam, that's the measurement then there, until 20 dunams. But they only had about 6 or 7% of the total area of groves. Most of the area was controlled by big, large owner, rich people, mainly who lived in Jaffa, and they owned more than 50% of the citrus groves, the Palestinian citrus groves by 1948. So this is basically very briefly, the history of the citrus industry, mainly the Palestinian one. But what I want to stress here that already then there was a lot of cooperation between the two sectors, which was a rarity between the other sectors, between the other industries of Palestine in other areas. World War II. While it was awful and terrible for many, and especially for Jews in Europe, Palestine experienced different type of war most of the time, except that they were very worried about, of course, their family members and societies and people in Europe. Palestine, during the war, experienced economic growth. It is called the prosperity period. And also, once the war broke out and the Arab revolt from 1936 to 1939 ended, there was unprecedented Arab and Jewish cooperation. One of the findings of our research was that most of the research on the mandate usually ends by 1939, and we continued that until 1948, especially the research on economic, social, and cultural issues. And during the war, there was unprecedented Arab-Jewish cooperation on many levels that I cannot elaborate more. One of the aspects, for example, was between Jewish mayors. This is Shabtai Levi, mayor of Haifa. This is Mustafa Halidi, mayor of Jerusalem. This is the High Commissioner McMichael. This is Aruf al-Bitar, mayor of Jaffa, and this is Israel Rokach, mayor of Tel Aviv. And they met together, they cooperated on many aspects. However, the citrus industry was in a crisis because the export was stopped because of the war. And in contrast to all other aspects of the economy and society in Palestine, the citrus industry became into a downturn and a crisis. That led to the second part of our that we found out in our book, the creation of a binational organization of Arab Jews during that period. I'm going to skip that. And there were two processes. One was a bottom-up meeting between Jews and Arabs. They created the Joint Executive Committee of Arab and Jewish growers in Palestine, and they met regularly in Jaffa to coordinate their actions. And the other one was top-down, created with the cooperation of the two sectors and with the British authorities. They established Citrus Marketing Board and Citrus Control Board. Those who grew up in Israel and familiar with the Moatza Leshivuk Beyadar, the Citrus Marketing Board, know only that it was an Israeli one, but we discovered that actually it began as a binational, divided between the Jews and the Arabs, the Zionists and the Palestinians. The labor movement under David Ben-Gurion also took part in that. And here a picture of the two important persons of the industry during the mandate, especially during this period, Said Baidas from Sheikh Muannes and Yitzhak Rokach, brother of Mayor of Tel Aviv, the two important persons of the industry that they cooperated and led the industry with the agreement of the rank and file growers during this period. Why it was possible to create a binational organization of Zionists and Palestinians during this volatile period. So in order to analyze it, we used Gordon Allport's important understanding of the nature of prejudice, and he stipulated 5 conditions. One, that there is a personal interaction between members of the groups that we know. 2, the groups have common goals. The groups work together to achieve their common goals. This was done already before the outbreak of World War II. However, equal status of the members was achieved then, and the support of the authorities. These 2 conditions we lack many times, and this is a major reason that we don't have more of that. We didn't have that more in the past, and also I think today. The Nakba. 700,000 Palestinians became refugees, most of them, all of them, where Israel was established. Most of the citrus groves became under Israeli control, and Israel defined them as abandoned property, and they were transferred into Israeli Jewish ownership. On the eve, during the war, Israel conducted a census of these groves, and we have the data for that, and we used it for our analysis. So this is one example that I found at the Israel State Archives. Some of the leaders of the Jewish sector in 1950 approached Israel Foreign Minister Moshe Sharet and asked him to assist in helping returning their friends, Palestinian growers and leaders, back to the country and getting their property back. And this is just short translation of what his answer was. However, allowing these people to enter would certainly create an opening for similar demands by many others. It would most definitely rekindle in the refugee camps the hopes of returning to the land. and would undermine the attitude of accepting the verdict to settle in other countries, an attitude which is extremely important for us to spread and strengthen. The last part of the book is about memory. I will not elaborate on that more. Here we see the painting by Palestinian artist, famous Palestinian artist Slimane Mansour on the cover of our book called Jaffa or Jaffa. This is another picture of him showing the attachment of the indigenous Palestinian people to the land, olive trees. And this is young Mahmoud Darwish, national poet for the Palestinians. So Jaffa and the citrus industry are important symbol for Palestinian memory to these days, and this is elaborated in our book. On the other side, in Israel, there was an attempt to forget that by national history, this picture that I took from textbook for elementary school about the citrus industry. There's no mentioning of Palestinian past there, of course. And this picture of a building near Jaffa, near Gaza Strip of former owner of Palestinian Grove. Kibbutz is built not far away from there. But hopefully the end is optimistic of cooperation and working together. This is Mustafa, and thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Abigail, for inviting me. And thank you, Nahum and Mustafa, who is not here, but thank you for the book, for the presentation, and also to Hadija. I want to say, I want to raise 4 points for discussion and for thinking for this excellent book. It's a short book, it's concise, it has its arguments and its sources. It's written in an extremely readable way, and it is a very important book. And I think it's a book that will be read and discussed, and very important contribution to the history and historiography of Israel and Palestine. So my first point is to point out the 2 main findings of the book, which are supported by extensive evidence. The first is the establishment of an official, countrywide, binational organization of the citrus industry in the first years of the Second World War. So from 1939 until the war, 1948, we have this serious binational organization that is active and takes place across the land. And the second important contribution is that the relations of Jews and Palestinians deepened in the years after 1939. Now, these 2 contributions together are important because they allow us to imagine historically what could have been imagined at the time, a different story of Jews and Palestinians in Palestine in 1948. That is the call into question the issue of inevitability. And they try to write a history of what if, and they give an example from people's experience and from the organizational life. Nahum stressed that from the 1930s, from 1930 through the 1930s, and certainly after 1939, there is a growing cooperation between Jews and Palestinians, citrus growers, and both their industries. And here I'd like to ask him to tell us why actually this happened. Because why is it that at the time of the Great Arab Revolt and the debate over the Peel Commission and the years of the Second World War, which saw the Zionists adopt the Biltmore program, which called for a Jewish state in entire Palestine, why is it in these years in which we might expect the two sides to draw further from each other, this industry comes together? So this first point, inevitability, perhaps a different story, and why it happens. My second point is that this book is important because it does what good history does. That is, it sees the history of Jews and Palestinians and of Israel and Palestine as one history, as a commingled story with reciprocal relations. I'm saying this is what all good history does, because the idea that we should separate the histories of people who live together, this goes against the grain and against the current historiography and of other historiographies. And we can think about broader historiographies, such as the relations of metropole and empires, or white and blacks in the American South, or also of the Holocaust. We can mention Omer Bartov's book about Buchach, which integrates Jews, Poles, Ukrainians, Germans, and Russians. So Jews and Palestinians, then and now, belong within the same history. And in this, Nahum and Mustafa join a distinguished body of work that goes back to Zachary Lockman and Ilan Pape, more recently to Hillel Cohen's book on 1929, Menachem Klein's book, and the book of Abigail Jacobson and Moshe Naor. So there is a distinguished body of work that takes this approach. It's an important one, and we should place this book within this approach. I'd say that Zionist historiography that explores the Yishuv and or Israel as an island into itself is like the sound of one hand clapping. This is much more a history as the author would have liked it to happen than actually the history as it did happen. My third point is about the methodological framework of the book. So there are two pillars. One is the relational approach that I just described, and the second is settler colonialism. Now, in these two pillars, there is a tension, because if you have settler colonialism, what kind of a relational approach do you have? I think that's, well, I'd like to ask Nahum to reflect on this, because it seems to me that in the book, settler colonialism is not developed enough. And after the introduction, it kind of get out of focus. There was a binational relations in the citrus industry, but as Mustafa and Nahum said, it is an enclave, which means in itself, it is bounded. It is an experience from below, which is important. Nahum and Mustafa say that we have a case here of binational experience that from below, which is important beyond some binational ideas such as Brit Shalom and others, which were which were uttered but not experienced. This is true, but we should also ask whether this binational enclave was in sync with mainstream Zionism, whether Ben-Gurion and the others took binationalism seriously at all. There are also uneven relations of power within this settler colonial framework. The Jews did not ask the Palestinians whether they want their company. They just arrived thanks to the British mandate. Had there been no British mandate, the Jews could not have emigrated into Palestine. And as Nahum told us in the last slide, the relations were not equal ones, and they were not supported by legal framework, which means that there is an inherent inequality in these relations. So I'm not saying, I'm thinking aloud here, I'm not saying that there wasn't a binational experience here, there was. But it was based on inequality. It was imposed on the Arabs. They did not want the Jews to begin with. And the question is, what were the limits of this experience? That it existed, it is clear. And I think it is important that the book put both the relational approach and the settler colonial approach together, because this is a tension that existed in the reality of things then, and it's also good methodologically. But I wonder whether the binational aspect of this experience has not been exaggerated in the book, and a settler colonial experience has been maybe downplayed. So I put it out there as a point to think about. And finally, I want to say something about the Nakba. So chapter 4 deals with the Nakba. And according to the 1947 partition plan, the large majority of Arab-Palestinian citrus culture was to have been under the control of the future Jewish state. And then, and I'm quoting, at this stage, the research on this crucial period lacks sufficient sources to reliably probe the views of Zionist leaders concerning the approximately 40% of Arab citizens slated to be included in the Jewish state. I wonder about that. I don't think that almost any person in the Yishuv had intentions of accepting 40% of Arabs as part of the Jewish state. Some said it explicitly, some said it implicitly, but by 1947, after 25 years of Zionism, after 10 years in which, after the Peel Commission gave the Jews a state without Arabs, because there would have been a transfer according to the Peel Commission report, I don't think that, it's not, I don't think, there are sources to show that both in practice, in policy, and in the Jewish imagination, there would not remain 40% of the Arabs in the Jewish state. The letters, the diaries of the period show this conclusively. The Jews are very worried about three things considering the partition resolution: about its serpentine borders, about the demography of the proposed Jewish state, and about the lack of full sovereignty. We forget today, perhaps, that the partition resolution established not only a Jewish state, but also an Arab state. And these two states had a confederate relations. They had an economic union. They both had militias, but not armies. And they were connected in many different ways. So the sovereignty of these two states were not complete. The Jews, I think, started the war with three aims in mind: to change the borders, to change the demography, and to have a full sovereign state. And they achieved it. So I think that the fact that some Jewish citrus owners appealed for their Arab colleagues and friends, as Nahum told us, and wanted them to be back, this is important. It's important on the individual level of human relations. But in terms of policy, we all know what happened to all these citrus groves. Just like we know what happened to the Arab lands. So we need to perhaps portray a picture which on the one hand is more decisive about the Jewish aims in 1947, and then also put in the human element, individual one, that was the exception that proved the rule. And I want to end by saying again that this is an important book. I'm honored to have been asked to participate, and I'm looking forward for the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Alon. Professor Gilman, how much time do I have? 2 minutes?
Go ahead. A few minutes. Yes, sure.
When do we need to finish?
It's 3:02, and so we have about 15 more minutes.
Okay.
So why don't you respond,
Okay.
and maybe people in this Kahal audience will think of, we'll have some brief questions as well.
Sure, I'll try to be very brief. So first of all, Alon, thank you so much again for participating and for the wonderful words that you said about the book. And it's really important that it's an honor that they come from you. So thank you. And thank you for your thoughtful comments. Briefly, for the history of cooperation, I just want to mention Gojansky's book and Lev Greenberg, to those you mentioned. For settler colonial, why, and you ask why they began cooperating in the 30s while the general society went up more apart. Even though, as you mentioned, during World War II, there was more cooperation. I don't have a full answer to that. I think on other aspects of agriculture, there was cooperation, but we don't have research on that. But one aspect that I thought we tried to answer in the book was because of the unique setting of the industry that the Jews had to market their food through the Arab merchants in Jaffa. They had to cooperate. Also, they exchange technological knowledge throughout the years. So they met regularly on Jaffa and managed and had deals, and sometimes Arabs sold their food to Jews and so forth. So there was a history of cooperation before they established the binational enclave. Because of the special condition of the industry that were not in other parts of the industry, of the life between Jews and Arabs, economic and social. But Tamir Goren's latest book, also we should mention about the relationship between Jaffa and Tel Aviv, discovers many aspects of of Arabs and Jews visiting each other in cooperation that we didn't know about before. So there's more that can be discovered. As for the influence of this binationalism on the entire society, so there's I think we mentioned that in our book. There's an important study by Guy Ben-Porat on Northern Ireland and Israel and Palestine, and the relationship between business people and the level of their influence on the political aspect. And he said that they didn't have the hegemony, the political capital to influence the political process in a way. So I think similarly in our case. Settler colonialism and relational. We follow Oren Iftahel's new approach. I think we mentioned that as well, that they studied more in urban context, that settler colonialism many times couldn't achieve its final goal. So settler colonialists come to stay, but many times you have relationship between, especially if you have between the two sides, especially when you have, you cannot win over the other side, as it happened in the US, for example. So I think this is, it's an interesting perspective to put these two together, but I think here it was incomplete. Settler colonialism, so more relational than settler colonialism. Finally, as for the attitude of the leadership, I think we were referring only to specific, we know about the attitudes, but we also should remember along that on the Palestinian and Arab side, there was also attitude to nip the Jewish enclave or the Yishuv in the bud. It was a zero-sum war on both sides in many ways. So I think we shouldn't forget that. But we were referring only to a specific committee, Va'adat HaMatzav, that Ben-Gurion established at the beginning of 1948 to see what to do, how to establish the state, and also what to do with the 40% of Arabs. And not every file is declassified. So this is where we refer to that we don't have the full information. So I think there's a difference between the attitude of people and the actual policy that they had to establish or thought about it. But of course, looking forward to your book to see new perspectives.
So in the chat, Michael Bernhock, you wrote an interesting comment. Do you want to speak a bit?
Sure, I'm happy to join. And Nahum and Mustafa, congratulations for this excellent book and achievement. I've learned a lot from your individual previous research and from this one as well. And just one other suggestion that may add to your explanations for the cooperation was that there was enough commercial room in the citrus market, at least until the mid-30s, for everybody. And after the war, obviously, during the war, the World War II war, everything changed, etc., as you described. But up until then, there was enough space for everybody, and they did have a common enemy, and those were the Spanish, competing with them in the British market. So they had an economic incentive to join forces in various aspects of the industry. It's just another explanation, I think, not an exclusive one, definitely not an exhaustive one, etc. And I was wondering what you think about it, of course.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think common enemy, we know from research that is an excellent way to unite the other side. So also I think the British were in a way economic enemy because they raised taxes during the 30s, during the Great Depression and so forth. So this also united the two sides as well. But I still think that from my reading of the primary sources, that they established friendships. They met in Tiberias, in the Sea of Galilee, and there was a history of cooperation that helped them to create the binational enclave. And alone, the enclave itself, I think there was equal status in the enclave, not between the societies, but in the enclave. And that fits the theory very well.
Yes, can I ask a question?
Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm David De Vries from Tel Aviv University. Hi, Nahum, hi, Alon. Very nice.
Hi, David.
Very interesting book to read. I'm going to read it very carefully. It's going to help my presentation. I think it's very important historiographically. I wanted to add a dimension, but because I haven't read the book yet, maybe it's all there. Something to do with the relations between the economics of the citrus industry and the cooperation during the Second World War. So because you cannot export the citrus, many growers lose their income. And the only thing that balances this downturn is the demand by the British forces, by the British armies in the Middle East, which create a lot of demand for not only for industry, not only for army materials, but also for food. And what happens to the citrus industry, of course, you probably mentioned it in your book, is that it adapts to the war economy. How it adapts to the war economy, instead of exporting the citrus to Liverpool, to Europe, you create industry which is based on producing all kinds of things which are based on the citrus fruits. Now, in order to respond to that demand, you have to create a pressure group, because you are totally dependent on the British government. You're totally dependent on the demand, not only of the British army, but of many armies that roam about in the Middle East and are connected to the Allied forces. Without creating a pressure group, you cannot achieve anything economically. And this is one of the reasons why after the war, for a short time, there is a rehabilitation of the industry. So I wondered, maybe there is an economic dimension here which explains why there is such a proximity of interests between various growers who do not for a moment shirk their national or nationalistic identities.
Thank you, David. We should Alon add David's studies on the mandate to our list of Jews and Arabs together. So we actually, in the book, we use Mansour Olson's The Logic of Collective Action, and we address that economic pressure to cooperate, but I decided not to elaborate on that in this lecture because I didn't want people to run away. But David, this is what we use. So we bring there was an economic incentive because of the economic crisis, because they couldn't market their food. So they began that even before the army began purchasing citrus from them. They formed pressure groups to petition the government, and that also helped creating the binational enclave. So absolutely, the economic difficulties help in this direction, and maybe we should think about that for Israel-Palestine economic binationalism, some depression, economic depression here.
I think I'm going to need to wrap up our meeting. And I just want to thank you for not just for the talk, but the wonderful PowerPoint, the slides, and the archival materials. I'm sure there's just a treasure trove of such things, but every photograph, I took some pictures with my phone, the photographs in those documents. I mean, you are historians, and you know, this is like what you do all the time, but we kind of opening that up for us, and such a beautiful slideshow, and for your methodology and your approach, and both also what Alon was saying about writing a new kind of history. And I think that you've taught us something very important, and you're inspiring to us students and scholars and listeners, and just in terms of the stories we're telling and how we're thinking about it. And so it's very important work. Thank you, everybody.